With the recent Switch 2 trailers, a lot of people have asked me how the new console will affect Breath of the Wild speedruns. We know that the Switch 2 has way faster load times, so it might be time to switch to a new console. That being said, while it's easy to assume that runs will be significantly faster, there's more to consider than just load times, and in this video, I'll be going over everything we've seen so far and try to outline some of the most likely impacts of this very expensive upgrade. I've broken things down into 3 sections: load times, version differences, and new features. So buckle in, we've got loads to talk about. Here's the warp comparison that they showed in the Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom overview trailer. They're going from the Great Plateau to Hateno Tower, and it saves 7.5 seconds. If we take a closer look, we see that the Switch 1 load takes a total of 12.4 seconds, while the Switch 2 load takes 5.1. The clip they showed is a bit weird since they cut off the Switch 1 load as soon as the logo filled, but the treehouse segment had another example of a warp which saved roughly the same amount of time, so it seems to be consistent. Now, the reason I brought up total load time is that the examples that they've shown so far are both warps, which usually take more time compared to Shrine and other loading screens. So to get an idea of how much time the performance improvements save, we need to look at everything. I've done a fair bit of load analysis on Plateau, and the Shrine loads are pretty consistent. It varies a bit between shrines, but on average it takes 8 to 10 seconds for the entry as well as the exit. That's roughly the same amount of time save as the warps, so unless they're instant, we won't be saving the full 8 seconds. But there's an extra hidden time save that could come into play because of the way the monk cutscenes work at the ends of shrines. Games are pretty clever when it comes to masking loading times, and in Breath of the Wild, that takes the form of using the monk fading away cutscene as an opportunity to preemptively load the overworld. So watching the cutscene until the monk is fully faded away results in a significantly faster load than skipping immediately. It saves around 5 seconds per shrine, so in an any percent run you save 20 seconds, and in a 100% speedrun, you save 10 minutes. But with the Switch 2, this wait might not be necessary, in which case we'll be saving even more time per shrine. For any percent, the loads to take into account are the 8 shrine loads, 2 per shrine, the loads at the top of the Temple of Time, loading the castle for the first time, and then the loads between the boss fights, which includes Blight's, Calamity, and Dark Beast. There's also world loads, which are the freeze frames that happen when we move too fast for the game to smoothly load everything in. These are very noticeable, but ultimately don't make up a large portion of the run. I'm currently assuming that world loads will be completely gone, which would save 10 to 15 seconds. For the shrine loads, let's assume that each entry saves 5.5 seconds, since the warp loads take around 60% less time and an average shrine entry is around 9 seconds. For exits, it's a bit more complicated because of the load manip, but let's assume each one saves 8 seconds, because the full load takes 20 seconds if you skip immediately. Then we reduce it by 60%, and then subtract that from 15, since that's how long the load takes with the manip, factoring in the extra weight. This likely isn't going to be perfect, but it's good enough for now. That means we're saving 13.5 seconds per shrine, for a total of 54 seconds. Now let's look at the rest of the loads. The Temple of Time is mostly skipping cutscenes, so the actual loading time is only 6 to 7 seconds. The castle cutscene is around 8 seconds. And then all of Blight's, Calamity, and Dark Beast loads end up being around 20 seconds. That's roughly 35 seconds of loads for the rest of the game, which is a lot less than I thought. If we use the same 60% reduction, we've saved another 21 seconds. So factoring in world loads, we end up with a total time save of 85 to 90 seconds. As of right now, that would cut the time down to somewhere in the 21-30 range, which makes sub 20 still out of reach. Now for some real quick and dirty estimation, let's look at how much loading improvements could save for 100% speedruns. 120 shrines times 13.5 seconds, plus 27 warps in the current route times 8 seconds, plus 4 Divine Beasts times 20 seconds, which is a random guess, but Divine Beast loads are pretty chunky, equals 1,916 seconds, or 31 minutes. And that's a conservative estimate. The load improvements might also warp the way we route certain categories, since fast travel won't be slow anymore. So if there's faster overworld movement from a nearby shrine, we'll be more likely to teleport there instead. But performance upgrades aren't necessarily a strict improvement. Sometimes we take advantage of lag and slow loads to save time. Most notably, we use a trick called a super launch, which uses the lowered frame rate from looking at laggy areas to increase the speed of our wind bombs. In order to maintain smooth gameplay and lower frame rates, the game increases Link's speed by 50%. So, by generating lag using the quick menu and then pausing, we can ensure that we open the glider on a lag frame, which captures that speed boost for the rest of the flight. But this only works if the game lags. Luckily, it's only used in categories longer than any percent, and doesn't save too much time overdoing multiple wind bombs, so the faster loads will more than make up for it. The other potential loss is unloaded objects. In any percent, we enter the castle through a gate, which, with BLSS speed, isn't always loaded in. But it's likely that faster load times will prevent this from happening. The backup is to clip through the wall, which isn't that much slower with an optimal execution, only losing 15 seconds. So, with how much faster the loads are, it definitely still saves time, even if it's more annoying. In a way, it's more consistent this way, since having the gate be random was a pretty frustrating way to lose runs. Unloaded stuff does come up in other categories as well, but the same reasoning applies. However, if the backup is clipping through walls, there's potential issues that come up, which I'll get into in the next section about version differences. It's been shown that there's a 1.7 version of Breath of the Wild, where the Switch version is currently on 1.6. The leaderboard rules require players to be on the latest version, so if they patch glitches, then things might get messy. The rule was put in place to prevent situations where earlier versions that are harder to get access to end up with glitches that save time, requiring players to downpatch, which isn't well supported on Switch. So it's a bit unfortunate that we're getting an update 8 years in that might upset that rule. But this is mostly speculative. We don't know what glitches will work or not, although we do have some confirmation from people's experiences in the hands-on playtest. Here's footage from Zeltic's recent video where he shows off a wind bomb. This is great news, since it means they likely didn't go out of their way to fix a lot of glitches. He also showed that whistle sprinting is still in the game. We've got even more footage thanks to another gracious tester, Sky, who managed to try out BLSS. At a glance, we see that the bow lift smuggle part still works, but the slide section at the end, which is really what makes the glitch useful, appears to fail. Link spinning around in place is something that can happen with BLSS, but to my knowledge, this will never happen on the current version of the game in this specific scenario. It's common when trying to BLSS on or with certain objects, like boxes or with Cuckoo or stall enemy head, and can kind of happen when you don't have any arrows. But in the clip, they have arrows and are using the tower ledge, which is where most tutorials recommend practicing because they're pretty easy to get started with. But this doesn't actually mean that it's entirely patched, since we only have a single clip to go off of. It does show that in the new version, presumably with the upgrade, the way BLSS works has changed. But that could be a result of the increased frame rate messing with physics, possibly making the step up more precise instead of having it not work at all. We'll have to wait and see. I do think that it's very interesting that they didn't patch out the smuggle, since that should be fairly trivial, but it could be an indication that any fixes were side effects of other system changes rather than targeted bug fixes. And given what we've seen so far, I'm hopeful that most things will still work, although honestly, I'd be pretty excited if BLSS was patched on the upgrade so that any percent could go back to the BTV route that got me hooked on speedrunning. Another important glitch that hasn't been tested yet is clipping. This includes shield clips, extended shield clips, and scope clips. I don't play on emulators, but I've heard that clips are either a lot harder or in some cases impossible to do on higher frame rates. So it's definitely something to be on the lookout for, since without clipping, any percent would lose a lot of time. Having to watch the Shrine of Resurrection cutscenes and get the tower first already loses like 4 or 5 minutes, so hopefully they still work. Longer speedruns have more time to make up for early game time loss through faster loads, so a run like 100% could still be faster even without clips. Though this does bring up an interesting point. Since it's possible to play the game without the upgrade, any incidental fixes due to increased frame rates should be avoidable if you just don't install the upgrade. And beyond that, there's likely going to be a way to play 1.6 on Switch 2, since at the very least, physical cartridges being sold right now are updated to 1.6. So people playing 1.6 on Switch 2 might get faster load times while still having the same capabilities of Switch 1 runs, which is where the players must play on current patch rule might get thrown out. If 1.7 comes to both Switch 1 and Switch 2 patching out glitches, then I can't imagine we'd decide to throw out all the runs that have been done over the last 8 years. I'm just hoping it's somehow a Switch 2 only patch, since the new features are only for Switch 2. So, what happens to the leaderboard? I think because the upgrade is more like DLC for the same game, as opposed to a new release like Wind Waker HD, it won't get its own speedrun.com page. But if it ends up being a lot faster, it'll likely get separated as a different tab on the leaderboard. Right now, we have a precedent for keeping different consoles on the same board as a filter, but almost nobody has a Wii U anyway, so it's not a big deal, whereas the Switch 2 is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people and could give a big advantage. Ultimately, the filter exists so that even if they were located on the same board, you could compare to others running with the same conditions. I just think most people will end up wanting separation, and this will likely be a community vote once we get our hands on the Switch 2 and know more about what we're dealing with. Now for the new features. Here's what's been shown so far. You can store items from your inventory on the app and transfer them to other people. It's also been stated that this works between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, although some items get converted if they're not compatible. On the surface, this seems like an incredibly broken feature for the speedrun, since you could just transfer a bunch of strong weapons and attack up food to make the fights trivial and skip all of the castle exploration that we currently do. But assuming this app is allowed to be used in speedruns, the rules don't allow for any prep prior to starting the game, so it likely wouldn't be useful. If there was a situation where this could be used, it would have to be from a game that the player started fresh, and at that point you aren't getting any real benefit from it, since any extra playthroughs for passing items over would also be stuck on plateau. We also don't know when the player gets access to this feature. They might lock it behind a certain amount of progress like the amiibo rune. One other thing to note is that because they're changing the inventory system to accommodate the new features, they're more likely to patch inventory slot transfer than other glitches. Maybe they don't, but if they're already changing the code, they could probably pretty easily clean it up so that we can't mass duplicate items. The daily bonus is a wheel that you can spin once per day that gives you a random effect. The list contains a few useful effects like hasty meal and bow repair, but from what they've shown so far, those are the only ones that seem at all useful to the run. And with how many options there are, it's unlikely that the RNG will be favorable. Resetting a run because the daily bonus didn't give you speed up sounds like a nightmare situation. I feel like the fact that we're using an app, and that it resets after 24 hours as opposed to the changing of the date, it won't be nearly as easy to cheese as amiibos, in which case you get one attempt per day. And finally, we have Zelda notes. This feature actually looks really fun, since it gives you a built-in object map with voice directions to get to nearby Koroks, and adds in new voice lines to add lore to the game. I don't know if it's been shown that the new voice lines are going to be added to Breath of the Wild, but for Tears of the Kingdom, there seems to be a lot, which would be nice for any lore enthusiasts out there. I bet this feature will be incredibly broken in 100% speedruns, since you can use it to get exact directions to nearby Koroks instead of having to memorize the entire route. Just kidding, of course, although I'm sure someone will make a video about 100%ing Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom using Zelda notes. I think that, from what's been shown in the trailers, these new features will not be usable in speedruns, and might be explicitly banned. That's because they use an app, which will likely require a Nintendo account to be linked, which is already a higher bar for entry than usual. But beyond that, the app is a live service and could be discontinued in the future, which would make the speedruns a lot less repeatable. That's all for new features, but the other thing I found interesting was the Switch 2 Pro controller. Third-party controllers have been adding extra buttons for a while now, but they rarely have NFC support. And the controller shape or feel is always just a bit different from the first-party Pro controller. I think extra buttons are nice, since some inputs in this game require a pretty awkward grip on the controller. Whistle sprinting either requires a remap, or holding the controller like this. So with extra buttons, it would make it easier for people to get comfortable with Breath of Wild speedrunning, although the price is definitely steep. But that's the end of the video. If you have any questions, or think I missed anything, then comment down below, and subscribe so you don't miss any future updates about Switch 2 speedrunning.